Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another SixyTimes Battle Lounge with the 2MK team. Today we are lighter on the number of people in the lounge, but we have a very clear target as to what we're working on, and as a result of that, we're probably going to be having a lot of relatively intense matches. This is our NA lounge for this game, meaning that you should have a decent connection if you are in the United States East Coast, and we don't expect anyone outside of that area too much. But if you have connection from Midwestern United States, or basically anywhere that you could probably reach the Atlantic Ocean fairly quickly, feel free to hop in and see what your connection looks like, see if you can get some good matches with us. We won't mind if it's a little laggy, and we'll definitely let you know if it's too difficult or unbearable. You'll probably notice yourself though. Today's focus for at least the wolf is moving into the opponent's space quickly enough to not be just hit back or countered on the way in. And from OmniRabbit, it's mostly the same old, keeping a specific space open and not losing focus on it. I have no idea what I'm working on. It mostly depends on who joins, but it's probably meter usage, as I do tend to fall short in terms of break holds and similar things, and end up just using the meter after the opponent break holds me. We had a decent stream earlier for the EU version of this content for the day. And while we're not expecting those players back, as far as we could tell they were in fact straight up EU players, we're hoping to have similar experiences later on into this lounge. As always, the lounge will probably only go on for 1 hour, or rather the stream will, and the lounge mostly depends on who's in it still then and who's had how many matches, how tired, etc. Stage is always technically the most interesting because you never know when you're going to end up in a part that has corners, other specific interactions, and so on, which tends to make it slightly harder to train certain things, and you end up often training wake-ups and the equivalent of, let's call it, wake-up pressure. Moving to the correct spot so that your opponent can't necessarily hit you while you still have your optimal strikes for their wake-up. We have had a change in our content for most games from playing loser stays on to playing winner stays on, and this has a lot to do with both our own practice and specific levels of how long the game's been out, how popular it is, and so on. Basically, if we're not expecting to see any beginners, you'll more likely see the winner stays on setup. That said, if we do find a beginner, it's often true that we will shift it so that that person is able to play more, even in the winner stays on setup. So, if you think you don't know how to play this game but would like to give it a try, you can still just jump in, maybe even let us know directly, and we'll make sure you get extra matches. Preferably as much experience as possible, but can't necessarily guarantee that you'll get to retry too quickly against the same opponent. One of the things the wolf faces as a main problem in playstyle is generally a specific type of repetition that allows him to be controlled by the opponent. That, basically. Understanding how to cause the wolf to do specific things is a fairly meaningful part of the play that we face, but it's not necessarily a good one to rely on. There, for example, I did the hold too early, but I'm not entirely sure it was wrong anyway. As a player, it's possible to just be stressed too quickly for certain scenarios. Which is often dealt with by pressing buttons more often. But it's not necessarily enough to get you out of bad situations to just do that. Especially up against opponents who will fake you out, and then once they've faked you out, have an understanding of where you're likely to go from there. This is compounded by your opponent simply not caring sometimes about the thing you are most likely to do after it. If I've set up a scenario in which your choices are to do the thing I want you to do, or do a thing I haven't thought of but do very little damage doing so, I have no reason to stop setting up that situation. This is a common problem that beginners face in these games, where a stronger player, or even just a more annoying player, will set up a situation over and over just to see what they do and then take advantage of it. And since this is mostly not something you can avoid no matter what you do, it will keep on coming up. And while these games are often a race between two players trying to do exactly that to each other, it doesn't necessarily help you when you don't know where this is going to go. We have Brad Wong in the smallest stage in the game. Well, if it was a stage quote-unquote counterpick, it was a good one, because not giving Kasumi a lot of room to maneuver here is probably one of the best things you can do. Brad can launch attacks from fairly far away, and if you have nowhere to retreat out of those attacks, the situation gets meaningfully worse quickly. His unconventional attack style and movement often leads to you just not bothering to defend. I find myself guilty of this fairly often. It doesn't take forever for Brad to actually do damage to you, but he does not necessarily get a lot out of it. The main part being able to read his moves enough to know what's actually happening. He does a lot more lows than other characters, which helps in one space. But you still have to hold them all correctly, which is honestly quite hard because his timing is also not normal. And once you've been struck, especially if you got struck in a counter hit and did the wrong move to begin with, you probably are better off continuing to block simply because there's not much chance of you getting the hit right. See? I haven't practiced this anywhere near enough to know what exactly am I supposed to hold here. But unfortunately, as we've had before in this, understanding that Brad is holdable, and it's mostly that he's a confusing character, that's the point. Just this alone is not enough in itself. He is also using some additional methods to make you have to hold in multiple directions. And until you learn to hold, many Brad players know the strings to keep doing block-wise. So you're not actually always better off just thinking, well, I'll just block, because he doesn't really have to stop, since you can never tell exactly what's going to happen next. That said, it's probably more likely to work with someone who has... It's probably likely to work better for someone who has better defense, assuming that there was any reason to pick. Right, this is basically my thought. There's no reason to pick Brad in that because it's not going to lead to the same sort of situation against a Honoka, because she doesn't have the same problems, and the player has better defense than me. So switching to Honoka as the mirror is technically better, because it's no longer about being unpredictable, it's now about being superior in movement. But OmniRapid's defense means that it's not actually necessary to engage in the movement part of the game at all. I can't say that with certainty because I didn't really get to see how good my opponent is. I got to see how confusing Brad is, and now I'm probably going to get to see some information about how good the opponent is. Advancing isn't really Omni's best bet here, but once in a position where things are too close to do otherwise, it's often a good plan regardless, simply because not advancing means you have to find a way and time to get out of position. Unfortunately, one of the main problems that our second Honoka is going to face here is there's no way to get any true space advantage and no way to get any true damage advantage. The more relentless Honoka tends to have the better damage, and Ami's defense along with staying in the correct spacing is probably better. You'll see a lot of interactions where things don't go perfectly right because it's entirely about going for some sort of wake-up pressure and choosing wrong. Which is why we often suggest don't necessarily do that too much in this game. If you don't know your optimal position on wake up, think more about how you can exploit your opponent's behavior than how you can pressure basically anything. You're not going to benefit the other way. she's such a neutral heavy character in many situations that actually getting better situations than relatively good damage can be kind of hard sometimes. And relying too much on her strikes just makes the whole thing harder still. So unfortunately I still didn't get to see how good this player is because the mirror match wasn't the place necessarily to challenge OmniRabbit's flow. I don't know what they could have chosen instead because Brad clearly wouldn't have been that much better, but so it is. Looks like they're out for now though. Maybe they found something to train, maybe not. But they are definitely gone. This is probably our beginner. We'll see what happens. I don't remember if this is Hitomi's base costume or not. But if so, yeah, beginner. This is probably a good thing, because the thing that Omni wanted to work on today is the sort of thing that is good for a beginner to go up against. You can see what sorts of strategies they think of, and probably have enough time to repeat it. Even if there's a lot of, let's say, mashing instead, dealing with Hitomi's mashed block strings isn't so bad. And when she does break through with pressure because you blocked one of the variations incorrectly, the damage doesn't tend to be terrible. The interesting thing is that when I say a beginner, I don't necessarily mean someone who doesn't know what they're doing game-wise. Like, if I say beginner, I don't mean this person knows no combos, this person doesn't know their character's moves. Those things aren't really required to get that from me. It's specifically not understanding other aspects of it, because you are allowed very easily through the combo trials and so on to this game. You could go into this as a beginner knowing every combo, but not knowing enough about the opponent's character, about spacing, about the ways people will tend to manipulate your movement or guard you, and so on. And it's kind of really stressful or painful sometimes to find yourself in the position of, I learned all the combos, I did all the things, I know how to hit, why am I losing? You're not really losing because you don't understand how to strike, it's that you don't understand if to strike. Unfortunately, I think Omni didn't get the stage that kind of suited this purpose. But there's still enough space in here to get a little bit going. That's sort of the moment I was talking about there. Hitomi does decent damage. She definitely is no slouch on it. Even when you block incorrectly, you still have to care about some main stuff. But it's not in itself the overwhelming reason. You'll notice that we're not seeing a full pressure game being played here. If anything, Omni is the one playing the pressure game. Oof, sudden. And that's a good response, a good basic response to get to see from that spot, because we are again talking about how do I make this move work the way I want it to. Still though, a little too cramped to get a lot of options at trying it. We do have a Hitomi bot, and range, which is decent, but this game only gives you 3 recordings, and that causes the variation to be relatively reserved. It's much harder to do specific things altogether. One of the main things Diego needs in this matchup is to simply find more ways to use the kick. Even though the kick itself is equally predictable, the ranges that Kokoro fights from means that the punches are worse. And she's not a character that suffers terribly. Her holds lead to advantageous situations for her often enough that even using the standard punches into throw setup is taking more risks than you really need to. When you're forced into close range, by all means go for it, but you're seeing here a more measured way of dealing with it. Understanding that if your opponent is close to you but hasn't decided to attack yet, if they're on the way to attacking, there's a good chance that Diego's low kick will get them. And once the low kick is working, you can start worrying about other things. Not many characters get good combos off their low kicks, but the quote-unquote rushdown characters tend to get a little something, and Diego gets more than most. One of the problems you'll face is obviously it being too difficult to do at max range, but we're not talking about max range most of the time. We're talking about advantage situations where you can just push on the opponent too much. That whiff punish fell a little short. Another scenario where Kokoro tends to come out on top even though you'd think it was going to be at least even is in the throw tech scenario. There is a limit on how many times you can consecutively win in these lounges. Usually it's 3 at a time. Just, you know, it's stream. People want to play. You get other options. I was about to note that technically going from Diego to base would have made the matchup easier on me. Not necessarily a lot easier, but easier enough that it would be noticeable. On the other hand, this player's way of flowing means that there's a chance that that's not true. One of the main things that helps here is that when Diego's really getting into it and isn't on defense, there's a specific spacing at which he wants to hit with lows, he wants to swipe at your feet. And he often does this as a reaction to things. And Kasumi can approach that space without actually getting into the position where this is a good idea from his side. Perfectly done. So most of what I'm going to be looking for here is opportunities to get out of position without my opponent thinking too much about what I'm doing. Because their goal has to be completely different than it is usually. Went too long. I think I was supposed to use the punch there. And I overextended in one way that I did not expect. That is a choice that I have not met a Diego making that choice for a while. It's a good choice, I just don't really see people doing it. Perfectly done with the kick. And I took too long on that move. I probably should have gone for a throw there, but I think I would have gotten hit out of it anyway. Notice what I was telling you before. Kokoro is in a spot where once you hit with the low, you get stuff. Kasumi is not generally there. Oh, I thought I had the hold. It's very important to understand in this game that once you have been hit the first time, depending on your opponent's combo, you cannot immediately just go into hold if you were counter hit, I believe. This isn't an observation that stands up under every situation, but we have seen it enough times that it's a general piece of advice we give. And it's easy to make this mistake fairly often because the game offers you the hold. You know that under certain circumstances you can hold in the middle of your opponent's string, and it doesn't have to be a pressure string that you were blocking either. You can just hold out of certain strings while taking the hits. But the scenario is one where your opponent gets a benefit, a bonus to their continued strikes once they have whiff punished you or caused some scenario of that type. Meaning that if you've learned to focus on whether or not you made a mistake, and that's the reason you got hit, you can also probably get yourself to stay blocking instead of attempting to make a hold until whatever part of the string they're doing has shifted from I'm just continuing my pressure to I have noticed you're blocking and I need to open you up now. Because then you can start thinking about your options for holds. But even then, if you are still blocking and you're not going for a counterattack, your opponent doesn't really have to stop their pressure either. Lei Fang is not a character for whom this is heavily true most of the time. But she is hard to understand in terms of what you should and should not hold. In general, it's easier to just not hold this character at all until you're quite good at fighting her in neutral otherwise. Because as you'll notice, in general, if she is attacking you, she is flowing forward. She's not going to get a lot of opportunities to specifically stop and throw. She has good throws and she has good throw range, but for some reason, probably fairness, they did not give her the ability to just do things that she normally does and then immediately stop those things and throw you right after. But she will therefore keep on hitting you for a relatively long time, simply because that's the way she was given to retain control of the situation. Since she can't make you worry about the throw, she's allowed to hit you for longer, basically. And that's why you shouldn't try to hold her until you've seen her strings enough to see the gaps. When you see a pause in between the two of them, because they are separate strings, you're just not noticing that immediately. Then you can learn, okay, I'll hold that, but don't just go trying to hold this character in the middle of her hits, because you'll get hit. If you want to win the round, your option is obviously break hold. But you can spend a lot more time watching that sort of situation, and when you do get thrown, that's just part of the matchup as well. A lot of her strength is in her approach, though. The ability to get to where she needs to go without you specifically being able to do as much about it, depending on which character you're playing, of course. But in general, she'll have a way, a path that gets her past pretty much everyone, because she has so many options for getting in close. Many of them are whiff punishable if you know exactly where to be, but that's still not necessarily a good thing to start trying to do immediately, because you don't have time to learn all this if you're not used to fighting the character. One good thing that Omni has just inadvertently demonstrated is that you don't necessarily have to feel a huge amount of fear when she is the one keeping quiet. You can just go for it and just not worry about that sometimes, because unless you get yourself too close, chances are you're not going to take a ton of damage. In many cases, it's much better for Lei Fang to let you get in close so she can start to actually properly counter you, than it is to just use her space control to kick you away. Now here's a matchup that's likely to be problematic for both sides. But I can't say in advance what approach people are going to take to it, so there's no way to be sure. Kokoro is often too straightforward a character to get in against Mai easily, but once she's in, Mai is too straightforward a character at close range to do much about it. Meaning that you often want to save your meter for getting out of situations you don't like. No matter how dangerous this seems as a whole, Kokoro has so many different heights and ways of attacking if she really needs to, that it's not necessarily going to help. And Mai's damage, while good, is not necessarily overwhelming, so there's that. What seems to be quite helpful to this player, though, is their relatively good understanding of Kokoro strings. Or maybe they're just mid-holding because they haven't yet learned to not do that as a core thing. Nope, there we go. That kick hold means that they understand this. Ninjas flying all over the place as always. This is similar to what I was explaining before. It's about controlling Dewolf's flow. But eventually Dewolf will change out of that flow entirely, and you'll get hit, but you won't necessarily get hurt a lot. It's back to the, I can see that I can get hit, but I'm not necessarily going to be paying attention to whether or not that hit is going to matter. You can be slowly chipped to death under that condition, and it's quite often that that's exactly what happens. But the better you are at the holding, the less you have to think about this. It's usually better to just not push yourself too hard to get every single thing held. Just think about the ones that hurt you and hold those. All these different hair colors can make this game so confusing sometimes. Which shouldn't be, because I think that's like a more so the costumes and some similarity between character builds. This matchup is hard because it's almost entirely about very perfectly spaced close ranges. You can watch and see just how often these two players interact entirely based on whether or not one of them was just slightly out of range of the other, which they then think about and follow up with throw timings because they expect the opponent to stick a button into their space and whiff it, because that's how you get that scenario. You are slightly out of the way, your opponent is going to try to counter-strike you anyway, but they're going to miss by the tiniest bit. And usually, games will let you grab that outstretched limb. This is still very much a game that does allow this. Because of that, this match can end up looking extremely intense to anyone who doesn't understand the two characters particularly well. They're basically just in each other's face constantly, but because of their style of movement, they actually can get around the strikes of the other fairly often. And the better the players are, the more often this will happen, leading to it looking like people don't know what they're doing sometimes because they're just whiffing so much at very close ranges. But it's easy to think about. If they were just mashing, just doing basic moves, then they wouldn't whiff as much because most basic moves end up being highs or mids later on in a string, and someone would have to block, or they'd be held and had to do something else entirely. But the number of times you see the interaction and they're just slightly off of whatever they did choose to do, that's how you can tell that they're very focused on understanding that part of the close range game. The number of moves you see is probably your best indicator, basically. But now Omni gets the space required, the space intended. This isn't simply a matter of practicing doing those closing in moves, but explicitly combining it with the idea of just not doing them. Once you've learned to threaten with an advancing attack, your opponent learns to wait for it, especially if it is an attack that they could counter if they were paying attention. This often offers you a way to read your opponent's status, let's go with that. And moves that have this particular long start up, run up, or whatever, it allows you to not make that decision until the last moment. You could just feel it's time to use the move, start it, and then after that, quickly determine your opponent's state and choose how to continue the move, or in some cases not, and just run and stop there. Characters with long forward strikes will stop you, but they also can be held because running doesn't really prevent that. So if you know that they could stop you with a long forward strike but only have one, you can prepare to hold that move, and quite often get some benefit from it. And of course it helps that in many cases that move is a kick and you're already holding forward, so you just hit the hold button. One of the main things you normally want to do is to reduce the amount of actual complex decision making you have to do, in terms of execution and in terms of just being comfortable with one thing or another. And if you're underconfident, there's always break holds to use as just demonstrated there. Sufficient experience with these games is where all of this comes from, but it's also really important to know that that's where it will come from. Why is everyone showing us base today anyway? I feel it was a patch or something that I'm not aware of. So here's the same matchup. But Omni hasn't learned to play in the way that we saw Valkyria before. This isn't necessarily bad because it mostly means that Omni will accept blocking and end up further out, and then try to play a mix-up throw game at closer ranges, which is equally effective but much more punishable if base does a lot of damage, because he can just do a lot of damage in those scenarios. Basically, there's a lot more to be used here in terms of control from Honoka's side, but taking a much bigger risk the moment you get grabbed, or in some way like tricked. Fortunately, this is also the style of play where the base bot that we have designed does actually help you, because you will end up learning a lot of the same spacings from that bot, and therefore know how to do it. And Omni helped test that bot fairly heavily, I think, meaning that he's likely to have a clearer idea of exactly where to stand. Not necessarily how to deal with all the moves base does, because the bot explicitly tells you you can't deal with all the moves. Sidestepping helps, understanding what not to sidestep, equally important. And he's not a great character for holds. In fact, the bot's job is to teach you, yes, you've learned to hold because you're supposed to start with Hitomi. We get it, you've learned to hold. Now learn not to do that, because if you do that, you will probably take a lot more damage than you need to. I have no idea if this person's going to try to play this match, but I'm definitely not expecting that one bar to help a lot. That said, we've learned from many games that one bar does not actually mean that the match is going to be terribly poor lag-wise. This has a lot more to do with instability than it has to do with distance. So depending on the rollback or the system used in general, it can be really bad, or it can be sort of okay. And I guess we'll find out one way or another, because if Omni wins this, then it's fine, and if not, then it's probably me next, and we'll see what happens. It would probably also bring us close to end of stream, but it depends. I don't know, that's fine from my side. Same thing again though. One of the things that helps Honoka in this matchup compared to many other characters is the sheer amount of really stunning moves she has. It's hard to tell because if you're not too familiar, it's not easy to see why I say that, but it's definitely possible for a character to have moves that once they do strike, it's much harder to stop them from keeping doing things. Usually these moves are very straightforward and therefore not allowed to be terribly non-obvious, basically, but the point of them is to use them as interrupts and whiff punishes, so that when your opponent gets hit, you don't have to worry, okay, I hit you, but now I also have to make sure that you didn't figure out which thing I was going to do next. No, you just hit them, and then you hit them some more. Because the reward you were aiming for was not one based on did you get through their defense with your cool moves, it was did you read them correctly to get this far, and once you have gotten this far, it's kind of rough to also then require you to finish special combos or similar. We're seeing a little of what was mentioned before though. That was an interesting choice, because that's like the lace damage you can do, but it's also one of the hardest moves to do, I think. I think they didn't finish that one off either. I'll be able to get a report as to whether or not this was actually laggy in a bit, but it looks like it went up to 2 bars, so technically that implies it probably isn't that laggy. In those scenarios, things just tend to get better rather than worse. You're now seeing the aforementioned thing that you didn't get to see in the last match. While the bass player is definitely winning this in the proper ways close up, that sort of thing, that moment of, oh, there is all of that damage all at once, can easily chunk out your health enough to make this bad for you. One of the main problems with this matchup in this case is that the arena is quite small, and that means that once base gets started, he's a freight train that you can't do much about. But the same goes for Honoka in a different way. it's harder for base to get away from specific situations, and they both spend a lot more time thinking about how to get that done correctly. You see Omni therefore waiting until the very end to actually back off on the wake up. Throwing in some mind games required. But I believe that makes it his third win and pushes us around a bit. But this time I don't necessarily intend to go into spectate, it's just taking a little while to roll around. From that perspective, I expect we're going to end up with the lounge ending in either 1 or 2 matches, depending on how this one goes. And I should probably play Nico again, simply because we were already discussing a thing that the wolf could work on, so we might as well push on it. Since this player's aim for the day is working on getting into specific situations and keeping control of the opponent using the correct block strings, it offers me some opportunity to learn them, but on the other hand, correct block strings are usually whatever your opponent isn't expecting. With her very slightly advancing moves, she can stay in those positions better, and because she advances at just about the same rate that she pushes the opponent back, unlike Nico, who tends to advance too far into the opponent's space when blocked. The main problem Kokoro has to deal with in these scenarios is entirely different than you might expect her to have to deal with. Namely, getting held way too much. Good choice given that I had run out. That is unfortunate because that was literally each of us ducking under the other's throw every time. Not even a throw tech that randomly came out in the end. Just, nope, don't care. At least we got the throw attacks that time. That was a situation similar to what I was mentioning before. My opponent could either go for the standard kick to hit me harder and get started, or the low which won't start anything, and therefore I don't really fear it as much. Therefore, I went with the option that I didn't fear as much. Nico does have a lot more of that aforementioned stunning effect that Honoka has. But while I can't count on it for a lot of things, the scenarios in which she gets to use it are much better. But in this matchup, I must, as mentioned, focus on making sure that when I do get push, that my opponent does not get out of this position I want. So I must switch to using moves where once they've been blocked, I don't have to worry about my opponent being in my face. Therefore, taking this advantage now is important simply for that reason, if nothing else. That was the wrong kick though. probably worth it. Ah, I missed the down. But that range was a telegraph. That range was, you can only reach with that punch from here. In a lot of cases, that's what people are holding. They're not necessarily going, I know exactly what move you're going to hit next. They're going, I know which of your moves reaches me from here. And that means that it's harder to hold characters who don't have that limitation, such as Brad, and to some extent Kasumi. Kasumi at least gives you a long time, so the things you can do are literally reactable, and many of them are sidesteppable. But in that case, Kokoro as a character doesn't have a lot of confusing rushes, so I was able to say, this is the spot you're going to get to. That, however, brings us approximately to the end of our stream. You can find all of our bots for this game and others, as useful as those are, at our website 2-mk.org, and all of our information on whether or not we are streaming and what we are streaming on our Twitter 2_mk_FGC. Unfortunately, you will be denied the view of this glorious Kasumi mirror match, because we do like to keep the stream to a particular length. This has been Iridian for Team 2MK. Good luck with your training, and good night, everyone.